iGlobenews is very pleased to present Ambassador Thomas Greminger in our iGlobenews Pods interview series. Before we start, I would like to introduce Ambassador Greminger. Ambassador Thomas Greminger served as Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, from 2017 until 2020. On May 1st of this year, he took over as Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Before this, he served as Deputy Director General of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. From 2010 to 2015, he served as the permanent representative of Switzerland to the OSCE, the United Nations, and the international organizations in Vienna. As a member of the OSCE Troika, he chaired the OSCE Mediterranean Contact Group and the OSCE Asian Contact Group. From 2004 to 2010, he served as head of the Human Security Division of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Zurich, is a lieutenant colonel, and has authored numerous publications on military history, conflict management, peacekeeping, development, and human rights. Welcome. Thank you very much, Ambassador Greminger, for joining me today. As Secretary General of the OSCE, you were effective crisis manager supporting successive chairmanships in an increasingly polarized environment. You promoted multilateralism by strengthening the OSCE's ties with international and regional organizations and highlighted the OSCE's contribution to helping participating states implement the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to start our interview with a question on the Cooperative Security Initiative you initiated during your time as Secretary General of the OSCE. The OSCE mission involves, inter alia, maintaining and enhancing security in Europe through multilateral cooperation and other measures. During your time as Secretary General, you were instrumental in the launch of the Cooperative Security Initiative, or CSI. In your opening speech for the launch of the Cooperative Security Report, you noted the declining trust in multilateralism. It is, of course, laudable to want to support multilateralism, but realpolitik now points in another direction. My first question would be, do you believe in multilateralism and cooperative and comprehensive security for Europe?
Well, thanks, Diana. Thanks for having me this afternoon. I believe cooperative security is, in fact, realpolitik. If you assess all relevant security risks that we are currently facing, that we are going to face in the next couple of decades, both of classical, political, military nature, as well as transnational threats like terrorism, violent extremism, trafficking of all kinds, cyber, the linkages between security and climate change, rapid technological change, you name it. But all these risks can only be properly, successfully addressed in cross-border cooperation. And this is also true for the most powerful nations. They may do this and that unilaterally, bilaterally, but generally most relevant security risks can only be addressed in cooperation. And in that sense, cooperative security is at the end of the day national interest-driven policy. And you don't necessarily need to share values to pursue a cooperative security agenda. It is easier if you do share values, but it's possible without. What is decisive is that you agree on a number of areas where interests converge, where you can create win-win situations, and while disagreeing on many other things. So at the end of the day, cooperative security is realpolitik.
And what role should the Forum for Security Cooperation have in order to strengthen the OSCE in fulfilling its mission and enforcing multilateralism?
Well, as we all know, the Forum for Security Cooperation is unfortunately totally blocked for many years. basically, it was even before the crisis in around Ukraine in 2014 that it had become very sterile. So ideally, the forum would serve as a platform to discuss relevant political military challenges in a constructive way. How to apply current confidence and security building measures in a trust-inspiring way, how to modernize the Vienna document that stands for confidence and security building measures, how to reduce military risk in the Euro-Atlantic area, and obviously also looking ahead, what challenges will bring rapid technological change to future warfare, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, generally dealing with emerging disruptive technologies. I mean, it's not so that the FSC wouldn't deal with these issues at all. There are regularly security dialogues organized by FSC chairmanships, but for the time being, there is no established process on any of these issues, that would allow a systematic mapping of the challenges, and perhaps also at some point in time allow to elaborate confidence building measures when it comes to the use of these systems.
OSCE decisions are considered political commitments and thus not legally binding. How has the fact that the OSCE does not have a legally binding constituent treaty affected the work of the organization? In your opinion, should the OSCE be based on a legally binding treaty?
Yeah, absolutely. But let me say first that political commitments indeed represent only soft law, but since they're taken by consensus, they can be extremely powerful. And at times, they're more effective than conventions, that take ages to be ratified and implemented thanks through national legislation, while soft law is immediately politically binding. So in that sense, I think that's a powerful instrument. But the question that you're driving at is the fact that the OSCE still does not have a constitutional document, no charter, and this presents major disadvantages for the organization. It's in particular a huge obstacle for all operational activities. Our field operations, 16 in total, they all operate under different legal conditions. It's a constant process of negotiating memoranda of understanding with host states. It's complicated and also very difficult to predict. And in particular, if you have missions like the special monitoring mission to Ukraine, a huge operation that needs to be urgently set up, and you first have to negotiate basically the terms of hosting this operation with the host state. This is time consuming and makes things very complicated. And at the end of the day, it also creates insecurity and unpredictability for OSCE staff working in the field all over the OSCE area. So clearly a massive deficit that would need to be corrected.
During your time as OSCE Secretary General, you conducted the fit-for-purpose reform agenda focused on adapting the OSCE to changing realities and new opportunities against the background of limited and declining resources. Why did you decide to initiate this project? And were you the first Secretary General to conduct such a project and make concrete suggestions for reforming the OSCE?
Yes, it's correct. In February 2018, I submitted a relatively ambitious reform agenda to participating states. And I do believe that I was the first Secretary General daring to do so. This agenda, if you look at it, contains a number of more political elements, like, for instance, creating more space for informal dialogue. But it also lists 7 rather managerial and organizational objectives. And one very important objective focused on internal management processes. You know, the OSCE Secretariat grew organically over 25 years and, you know, never really systematically looked at what had happened in terms of processes, in terms of organizational setup. So what I did, I had a very systematic look at it, very participatory. Every single staff member participated, and I was supported by Ernst & Young, a major consultancy, and we identified a total of 80 optimizing measures, and we managed to implement most of them, around 70. Yeah? Some we abandoned for a number of reasons, and some still need to be implemented, but the bulk of it we managed to implement within a couple of years. And just to give you an idea of the pattern of these measures, very often it was about digitalizing paper-based work processes. And obviously that makes matters quicker and more efficient, and often also less costly. And in that sense, I think this was clearly an exercise that paid off in terms of savings, but also in terms of impact.
So you were trying to bring the paperless office to the OSCE, maybe? Was that one of your goals?
I would be not the perfect role model. I'm still very much of the paper generation, but you know, it's a different thing if you use paper to write down some of your speaking points, or if you need a paper trail to, for instance, pay out salaries. And I think this is now feasible without paper.
Excellent. One section of the Fit for Purpose agenda was a management review, as you had just mentioned. Even though your goal was not to cut costs, you ended up saving, as I read, around 300,000 euros in 2019 alone. Participating states, and by implication the taxpayer of these states, contribute to the OSCE. It would seem that cutting costs would be important for any Secretary General. Have your successors continued to cut costs and optimize workflows?
I'm sure that my successor, Helga Schmidt, is continuing to do exactly that. But of course, you're absolutely right in insisting that international organizations do have to work in a cost-conscious way. They do need to constantly strive for efficiencies. This is, for me, also a very important element of, you know, what is so often referred to as effective multilateralism. So this is an important responsibility of the organization, its staff, its leadership. At the same time, and I would very much want to insist on it, there is also a responsibility by participating states to provide the organization with the resources it needs to fulfill its mandate. And here, as you may be aware of, the OSCE has a history of, I think by now, 11 years of zero nominal growth. Now you learn in the first semester of economic studies that zero nominal growth basically implies around -2% in real terms. And now you can add it up. In real terms, the OSCE has basically lost in budget about 25% over the last 11, 12 years. And this, you know, you can do austerity policies for a couple of years, but at some point, you know, you're down to the bone. And I think that's the case with the OSCE right now. And I think participating states are at the crossroads. Either they continue with these policies and starve the OSCE to death, or they change it and provide the organization with adequate resources.
Do you have a feeling in what direction it will go?
Look, right now, we had last year, there was a moment in the budgetary process where, for instance, the US ambassador acknowledged in a permanent council meeting that he would support back home a non-zero nominal growth outcome, meaning he would be ready to reconsider this dogma, or have Washington reconsider this dogma. But then in the end game of the budget process, there was somebody else that blocked a close to zero real growth outcome. And at the end, we again had to put up with zero nominal growth. So for the time being, while more ambassadors and capitals are aware that this is an impasse, the turnaround has not been achieved yet, not least because there is not enough political engagement by capitals as opposed to the budget of the special monitoring mission to Ukraine. There, for instance, the previous year, participating states agreed to a plus 8.5% budget increase.
Okay.
And the budget was approved on time on top of it. So you can see the difference. Is there a strong political engagement by capital or not? Unfortunately, for the regular budget for the OSCE, there is no interest in capitals.
Interesting. One recommendation of the Fit for Purpose agenda was to make the ethics coordinator and the gender issues program directly accountable to the Secretary General. This was met with resistance from some participating states. Can you tell our listeners more about the functions of the ethics coordinator and the gender issues program and why some states would not support this? Were these the same participating states which were against your suggestion to appoint a deputy head of the Secretariat?
Partly, yes. I mean, your hypothesis is indeed correct. There is a tendency with some participating states, and you only need a relatively few, because it's a consensus-based organization, and the budget needs to be approved by all 57. There are a few that do have a strong leaning to micromanaging the Secretariat in all ways, and that clearly needs to be stopped. Partly, this is done unconsciously, I believe, because the budget approval processes are as they are, with a budget committee meeting very, very frequently. I mean, if you compare with other organizations like the Council of Europe, it's, I mean, you won't believe it. And so I would say partly it's the process that kind of, leads participating states to micromanaging the Secretariat, and in particular through the budget. Partly, it is true, it's also a conscious policy to control the Secretariat very closely, and also to impose very particular interests. But at the end, I believe this is a very small minority. Now, on the ethics coordinator. The ethics coordinator plays a key role in ensuring compliance of OSCE staff with the Code of Conduct, and in particular, for instance, with implementing the zero tolerance policy when it comes to sexual harassment. So he or she is basically the figure in the Secretariat that has to make sure by prevention, by training people, etc., but also by making sure that there is no impunity for misbehavior. And so I wanted to have the ethics coordinator reporting directly to me. some participating states, for instance, felt that this would weaken the human resource department, which is, of course, complete nonsense. On the contrary, it would actually be a powerful support of the human resource department. But at the end of the day, I think 1 or 2 states resisted, and so the good news is the position exists. The bad news is it is hierarchically not where it should be, and it is not properly staffed. That is, of course, staffing is then also another issue, and here again we talk about money, and here there is clearly a discrepancy, particularly also by Western states. On the one hand, they have they do strong advocacy, and rightly so, for gender policies, for combating sexual harassment, but then they're not ready to put the money where the mouth is, and so this I think is a discrepancy that is striking if you lead a secretariat, as I did as Secretary General. Now, when it comes, and let me close this answer on a positive note, when it comes to gender policies, I would still say we have achieved a lot over the last few years. We have adopted a gender parity strategy and also implemented key provisions of it. For instance, OSCE's directorate had a 50-50 parity when I left. I adopted an action plan to combat sexual harassment. We advanced very much work on sexual abuse and exploitation. So I think the track record is positive, but clearly with more resources, you could also do more. And in particular, when it comes to the internal governance of the OSCE, I think participating states should be aware that there are a number of challenges looming that need to be tackled in the years to come.
So if I understand your answer correctly, no one is particularly employed to be the ethics coordinator. That's just a job someone who's already employed takes on, because you mentioned that you need a specially qualified person to do that function?
No, that is not quite correct. There was a very qualified person appointed, ethics coordinator, but I would have liked this person to report directly to me. Okay. I would have also given that function a higher salary category, which then obviously also impacts, the choice of people that you have. But we have an excellent ethics coordinator, but she would clearly need also more support around her in order to be more effective in implementing her tasks.
And when you say micromanagement, could you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, for instance, I think you referred in one of your questions to a typical act of micromanagement. From the very beginning, when I took over, I had 2 deputy heads of secretariat. The OSCE participating states are not ready to afford a full-time deputy secretary general. So the director of the Conflict Prevention Center is the first deputy head of secretariat, but since this director already has a full plate by the tasks of the Conflict Prevention Center, this would not allow this person to fulfill the tasks of a deputy. So from the very beginning, I worked with the second deputy, the director of the SG's office, had this function, and dealt with more of the internal managerial issues, while the CPC director dealt in deputizing with more of the conflict cycle related issues. Made a lot of sense. Everybody felt this is a very sensible approach to things. 2 years later, I tried to formalize that in the post table. So because I also had appointed a new director, OSCE, so I was kind of obliged to formalize it in the post table. And then one participating state thought that this had not been properly discussed with participating states. They had no arguments against it, but they told me, well, you should have discussed it with us more extensively, and they blocked it. So this is typically micromanaging. I mean, if you lead a secretariat of a good 400 staff, I think you know best how to organize yourself in order to to fulfill your managerial tasks.
Surely. For the OSCE to fulfill its mandate to manage and resolve conflicts and security threats and to provide a forum for dialogue, adequate funding is needed. We already mentioned this before. The OSCE has a unified budget and also extra budgetary resources. Can you elaborate on what these extra budgetary resources are? How does the OSCE approach these contributors? And do these contributors, such as aid agencies, multinational financial institutions, and private enterprises, expect something in return for their contributions?
Yeah, extra budgetary resources are very important, not least because the regular budget is very tight and has remained so now for many years. So extra budgetary resources finance much of the programmatic activities of the OSCE. Programmatic activities meaning work implemented by the field operations in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, but also work implemented by OSCE's institution, by ODIHR, be it, for instance, strengthening national rule of law, democratic institutions, helping states to become more resilient against violent extremism. Here, there are secretariat departments that do programmatic work, and this, the bulk of this work is being financed through extra budgetary resources. Do states expect something in return? Well, normally they would expect impact on the ground, and clearly it's a way, of course, for states to also particularly support, endorse activities that they deem important. So you can argue this is very selective, but at the end of the day, I would say, with very few exceptions, extra budgetary resources finance programmatic work that is very much in line with OSCE's medium-term strategy. Now, I've been trying to get big funders interested in the OSCE. That is aid agencies, international financial institutions, private foundations. And I had some initial successes, but then also realized that the OSCE needs to adapt its working modalities. An aid agency is not interested to finance a capacity building workshop, even if super important, but a 50,000 euro workshop is just, from an administrative point of view, for an aid agency, not to speak of an international financial institution, not interesting. You get into business with these donors once you talk 7 digits. And this implies that we move more systematically from projects to programs, from short-term horizons of 12, 18 months to 3 to 4 year time spans. And so this is a cultural and a mindset change. But I think it's doable, and there are also field missions that have advanced quite a bit on this path. Others still have to.
Has the current Secretary General continued with your projects to try to improve these extra budgetary resources as well?
Look, I'm not monitoring my successor on a daily basis, but I can tell you I had plenty of time to talk to her about my ideas, my concepts, and I got the impression that she bought into most of them.
Excellent. Last year was the 45th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. In your opinion, what role does the OSCE now have in securing and maintaining peace in Europe? In particular, can the special monitoring mission to Ukraine be a positive example of what the OSCE can achieve?
Absolutely. The OSCE still plays a key role when it comes to conflict management in Europe, but also when it comes to offering conflict resolution formats. All three protracted conflicts, the conflict in the Donbass, there are formats where the OSCE plays a role. In some of these formats, the OSCE is the key mediator, as for instance in the Transnistrian settlement process. In other formats, like in the Minsk process for Nagorno-Karabakh, the OSCE is basically a supportive actor while the key roles are being played by the three co-chairs. So the role of the OSCE differs from format to format, but at the end, these formats are the only thing that are around to push these conflicts towards resolution. You must know, at the end of the day, you need the political commitment by the parties to resolve a conflict, to end a conflict, and as an international organization, you can offer mediation support, you can offer support, and that needs to be in a smart and effective way, but you cannot substitute for lacking political will to resolve the conflict. I think that is important to acknowledge. Yeah, so the OSCE is, I think, still an important player. Unfortunately, mostly below the political radar screen. So, a noble politician does not know that the OSCE has been quite successful in making sure that there was no escalation of ceasefire violations in Nagorno-Karabakh. There was one in last October, a very massive one, but this, you cannot contain by the soft tools that the OSCE has. However, over many, many years, we managed to make sure that many local ceasefire violations did not spin out of control. And this takes me to special monitoring mission in Ukraine. I think the mission is highly successful in containing the conflict, in making sure that 3 million people on both sides of the line of contact have a more bearable life. Alone in 2019, the SMM facilitated more than 1,000 so-called windows of silence. These are basically ceasefires that would, on the one hand, prevent local violations from escalating, and on the other, and of course from a humanitarian point of view very important, allow to repair all this decisive infrastructure, gas, water, electricity, etc. And so in that sense, SMM has been highly successful. It's true, we haven't moved much closer to resolving the conflict. Here, the Trilateral Contact Group with Ambassador Heidi Grau as a mediator is trying hard. But again, you know, if the parties are not willing to make those concessions that are necessary to implement the Minsk agreements fully, we will not advance towards resolving it.
So do you, because you mentioned before, many politicians maybe aren't aware of it, do you think the OSCE needs more PR to display its own successes?
It would certainly more communication, a more powerful communication policy would certainly help, yeah. But I would also argue, and branding would help. The OSCE has not a clear brand. This is partly due to the fact that again, participating states are quite reluctant to allow the OSCE to have a very distinct profile. And then, of course, you have these annually changing chairmanships or chairpersonships, as we say today. And this brings different perspectives every year. And this does not facilitate branding. But still, I'm sure if a chair, a troika, has a strategic objective to brand the OSCE better, to strengthen communication policies, it would be doable.
Can you please elaborate on the role of the OSCE's confidence and security building measures, also known as CSBMs, in maintaining peace and security in Europe, and the importance of the Stockholm document on CSBMs and disarmament in Europe?
Yeah, well, very briefly, this is, of course, a key tool when it comes to reducing military risk. These confidence and security building measures basically have as objective to establish transparency on military activities. So if you conduct a major exercise that goes beyond a threshold, you need to announce it properly, and there are mechanisms to inquire with states if you think something looks shady, and so the challenge is twofold. On the one hand, we have an implementation gap when it comes to the current confidence and security building measures. Implementation gap often in the sense that they're not implemented in a trust-inspiring way. Perhaps they're implemented to the letter, but not in a way that would inspire the other side's trust. And the second challenge is substantively, they basically build on military realities at the end of the Cold War. So many important weapon systems that matter today, that would pose, security risks, are not covered by the Vienna document as it is currently valid. And you also have thresholds that are way too high. Today, if you have a well-equipped battalion in a wrong spot, this can be a huge security risk. While obviously when we came out of the Cold War, we talked not about battalions, we talked about divisions and corps. And today, these numbers would need to be lowered massively. Again, there is currently no agreement on this. So to cut a long story short, these measures would need to be modernized. And and those that already exist would need to be implemented in a more trust-inducing way.
Let me move now to the cyber world. The OSCE tackles various cyber threats, including cyber crimes and the use of the internet for terrorist purposes. A key focus is on the development of confidence-building measures among participating states to reduce the risks of conflict stemming from the use of information communication technologies. Can you explain to our listeners what these confidence-building measures are and why they were successful? And are there other such examples?
Yeah. First, perhaps, even if this at times a bit artificial, but you need to differentiate between the cyber confidence building measures that clearly target state cyber activities as opposed to cyber crime. Here we also do important work, but this is then more a capacity building type of work. For instance, in Central Asia, we try to make Central Asian states more resilient in combating cybercrime. When it comes to state cyber activities, here these 16 CBMs, as a main objective, they introduced a crisis management system, a crisis communication system to be precise, that would allow a state when he thinks that there is possibly a state-sponsored attack to trigger this crisis communication system and getting additional information in order to clarify what happened and to prevent escalations. In theory, the system is well set up. There are focal points in all states. They're regularly tested. They're regularly also practical exercises. That is fine. Real tests, there has been one in the beginning of this year. And clearly, you need more real testing of the system. The system per se, I think, is exemplary. That is also acknowledged, by other regions of the globe that look to the OSCE and feel inspired. The Organization, for instance, of American States is doing something similar. ASEAN has shown interest in these measures. So in that sense, the concept is compelling, but clearly at the end, it's also very much, a matter of do states trust the system and do states trust the others that are part of the system. And here, in a very polarized world, this is not obvious.
Thank you. In 2017, you established the Strategic Policy Support Unit. This unit was staffed by seconded experts from the US, the Russian Federation, the EU, and Switzerland. What did this unit do, which was lacking previously, and does it still exist?
Yeah, it does exist. To my knowledge, Helga Schmidt is still in the process of deciding where to place it exactly. That was also a process that I had already started, but could then not conclude. Basically, already when I chaired the Permanent Council in 2014 as Swiss ambassador, I was struck by the lack of strategic planning capacities in the Secretariat. And when I became Secretary General, I felt, we need every decent international organization has some strategic planning capacity. The OSCE had not, and it was easy to convince, key actors, and this is also why they made available top staff, and I think it worked very well. I think it improved the program outline, which is the medium-term strategy planning document, the formal one. Mm-hmm. It helped a number of incoming chairs prepare their priorities. It helped the Conflict Prevention Center to develop regional strategies. It also helped thematic departments to think a bit more medium term, a bit more strategic, and it produced papers on emerging issues. There was a very important paper produced, for instance, on the China factor. A very interesting paper was produced on how to make a chairpersonship less burdensome. And so, yes, I think this was a very important innovation.
Do you want to maybe share a few thoughts on the China factor, or how to make the it less burdensome to manage the OSCE?
Yeah, well, on the China factor, I mean, we could talk for the next hour, but just very briefly, it's obvious that Chinese policies, not least in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, including the concrete and the digital Belt and Road Initiative, they have repercussions. They have many positive repercussions, that is for sure, but they also have, I think, problematic repercussions on security of participating states, most obviously in Central Asia, but also in Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus. And, while you have in NATO and the European Union, you have well-developed work streams where, China and its policies are being looked at. States that are not part of these organizations have little. And so I was also encouraged by them, to set up a work stream within the OSCE that would allow to have a constructive but critical dialogue on these issues. And I think we came a ways with this topic, but far from establishing on the agenda. There has recently been a good study produced by the OSCE network of think tanks and academias, and I think that's a good first step and could build the basis also for a first informal mapping by participating states.
Very interesting, and certainly something one has to keep an eye on. I wanted to move now to your new book. You are in the process of launching a new book. I believe the title is Making the OSCE More Effective, Practical Recommendations from a Former Secretary General. I was wondering if you'd like to share with our listeners some of those recommendations and when your book will be available to purchase.
Now, the title that you just quoted is the title of an article that raises, I would say, similar ideas, comes to similar conclusions. This article has been published at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies of the University of Hamburg. A couple of months ago, I think you would find it easily. My book is a bit more comprehensive, also looks more comprehensively at the implementation of my reform agenda, what worked, what did not work, and indeed comes up with 10 more technical and 10 more political recommendations. Now, I spare going into the details. You can then, of course, read the book. It should be published in a few weeks, English online, and then perhaps in a month or so, paper copies will also be available, and then perhaps a German version will last perhaps another month. So within the next 2 months, you should have both English and German versions of the book available. The title is Multilateralism in Transition, Challenges and Opportunities for the OSCE. it contains a number of smaller articles plus my contribution that is relatively comprehensive. Politically, perhaps one idea that I would want to mention here is I think we need much more political engagement. We need ministers of foreign affairs, we need heads of states again to engage. And in view of 2025, the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, I think it would be worthwhile to launch a process, a political process that would perhaps in a first stage focus on rather institutional issues, making the OSCE again more operational, reforming the cumbersome budget process, reforming a very time-consuming endeavor, and that is approving the agendas of standard conferences that every year, have a similar agenda anyway. And so there are a number of things that would make this organization more operational, more capable also to focus on real issues. And I think that would be the focus of a stage one of a political process. And stage two would then have to take us to 2025 to the Helsinki principles. I think, the thing is, nobody questions for the, 6 years later, the relevance of the Helsinki principles. But of course, we have totally different understandings of what they imply, of what they mean. And you can't now ask the states to recommit to these principles tomorrow. This would simply not be credible after all what happened over the last 30 years. So you would need a process that would allow to look at the dilemmas of these principles, and there are a number of dilemmas that we have seen popping up, and they would have to be tackled. And now, I'm not sure if we manage by 2025 in the current political climate to do so, but at least we could launch a process with the aim of doing so. After all, it also took quite a while, to get to the Helsinki Decalogue. It took quite a while then from 75 to the Paris Charter in 1990. I think you need to have a certain patience, and of course you need also an appropriate leadership with key actors if you want to get there. But I mean, that would be one of my key recommendations. We need more political engagement by capitals, by the level of minister and heads of state.
I think that's a message also that throughout our interview, it came up over and over again, that it was the political side which would need to be not worked on, but brought more into the boat, and maybe being more supportive of the whole organization in that sense. My final question is regarding your new position as the director of the Geneva Center for Policy Security. First of all, congratulations. You were recently appointed. Maybe you'd like to share with our listeners what this policy center is about and which themes you will focus on.
The GCSP, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, is a center of excellence for executive education. We offer training to mainly mid-career professionals in foreign affairs, in defense, in civil society, in a private sector on modern security challenges. We do long courses, up to an 8-month course, but very, very many, up to 100 a year, short customized courses on specific issues, like, for instance, leadership, crisis management, cybersecurity, arms control. So, and we are very much also client-driven. So, if you have a specific training need, we try to fulfill it. Then the GCSP is also a platform for inclusive dialogue, track 2, track 1.5 dialogues. That is a pillar that is not yet really developed, I find, and this will clearly be my ambition to do so. The GCSP is also a provider of policy advice in a number of security areas. It's a place to incubate brilliant project ideas, to make them ripe for institutionalization. And so it's a fascinating outfit here in Geneva, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Well, do you have any final words you'd like to say?
Well, thank you so much for the interest. And I mean, I enjoyed this talk with you. Yeah, I wish you a good audience.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Greminger. I too would like to very much thank you for taking your time to talk to me for iGlobenews and to talk to our listeners. And I think we learned very much about the OSCE, the workings of the OSCE, what could be improved in the future. And thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thank you.